And we're live. What's up, man? Good to see you again so soon.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I was delighted to connect with you at the book review the other day. I had watched the Hard Money film. When did it come out? Was it fairly recent that it came out?
Yeah, recently, a few weeks ago only.
Yeah. So I think I
Maybe
watched
a
it pretty
month.
much as soon as it came out. And then the reason why I was delayed today is because I wanted to watch it again and have it fresh. So I just finished it again. But
Nice.
yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about it. But before we get going, why don't you give everyone who maybe didn't tune into the book club and not familiar with you or the film just a bit of a background?
Well, I'm someone who's had an interest in economics for a long time, and Austrian economics in particular. And then I've only been into Bitcoin for a year or so, like pretty late to the Bitcoin world. But some of those ideas have been percolating with me for a long time. So when I found Bitcoin, its main proposition made sense to me. And I've worked in film, over the years. These days, I don't. I've got a different day job. It's just a hobby. And look, it's a similar path, I think, to what a lot of people follow when they first learn about Bitcoin. You go down this rabbit hole, and you just absorb so much information to the point where you feel like your brain's going to explode, and then you feel this urge to somehow get it out, or almost as a way to get it straight in your own head. I think that's a cliche when you say, unless you teach something, that's the only way you really understand
it's totally true. I mean, that's what all the conversations I have are about. I don't know. I don't really know what the hell I'm talking about. I'm just kind of figuring out as I go. And these conversations help me do that.
Exactly. So the film was kind of my version of that process. I started trying to, I listened to so many podcasts. And so that was a big part of the process, just sort of synthesizing. Like there's just so much good stuff out there, but it's distributed across hundreds of hours. I mean, it's all entertaining. I mean, I think everyone shares that feeling of when you're first excited about Bitcoin, you're just listening to hours and hours of this stuff. So I just for many months I would be listening to podcasts, and if I came across something that I found particularly interesting or fit into this kind of world that I was building, or this narrative that I was building, I would just screenshot it or make a note of it, and then I could go back. And that was kind of the way the film was built. It was just putting together these audio clips to build a bit of a narrative around money, because I think that the first step is understanding money as a generality before you go to Bitcoin. I think that's the best way to understand it, rather than coming at Bitcoin first. I mean, people come to Bitcoin obviously because they appreciate the technological elements or what have you. But yeah, for me, it's really money is step one. And then you realize why you have a problem, what's wrong with the money that we have today. And then it's really easy for Bitcoin to present the solution.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that constantly amazes me about this space, and one of the things that causes me to enjoy it so much, and you could make the case that, maybe this creates a bit too much of an echo chamber, but I think it's not quite, I think that could be fairly easily dismissed, but that we're all learning these things. And then, as you say, when you first kind of realize that there's another group of people that are interested in this stuff, thinking in a similar way and have come to a similar solution, because it's so compelling and you want to engage in it so much and you want to consume it so much, because I have to imagine that this is probably the case for you, because the case for so many people that for whatever reason, many of us are kind of uniquely the ones in our social group or our community or our family that started seeing things in a certain way. And for whatever reason, maybe we're ahead of the pack, maybe we're altogether wrong, although I don't think that's the case. But when you actually find that there's a shitload of other people that are kind of seeing things in a very similar way as you can't help but be excited by it and want to engage in it and want to contribute to it and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. It's funny to try and visualize that network. Like we're all, I guess Bitcoin Twitter is the place where all these ideas get shared, and it's almost like a new normal is created. But as you say, in I guess real life, most of us are that Bitcoin guy or girl,
Right.
like who's sort of seeing things in a different way.
Which is why, Bitcoin Twitter is so addictive, because it's all your homies, right? Everyone's thinking the same way, and you're smashing together these ideas and you're refining your understanding. And what could be more compelling than that?
It's so funny the way when I was first started to sort of get my head around this stuff, and I might have been on different podcasts where people would mention Bitcoin Twitter. Like, I'm not a Twitter user from way back, and I was like, oh, I wonder what that is. Like, do I have to sign up for that? Is that like a separate part of Twitter or something? But yeah, and then you finally start to kind of get to know, you get absorbed into that narrative. But yeah, it's like, my people are here. It's it's been a really, it's okay, it's all happening online, but for me, it's been a really visceral sense of finding a community and feeling at home, like in a real sense. It's been really good.
Me too. But why don't you dig into that a bit? Because I feel like a lot of people feel that way. And aside from coming to Bitcoin and seeing how it represents a solution to so many of the problems that we've all mutually identified over the course of many years, and how uplifting and energizing that can be, some people are don't like the word community, which I just think is dumb, but finding a group of people that are seeing things in a similar way to you and having the opportunity to interact with them is such a, for lack of a better term, life hack. To be able to engage in such a genuine and invigorating way with such a big group of people all over the world is one of the huge benefits of being involved in this stuff. And again, another reason for the genesis of this pod, because I just see all these people and I want to connect with them. So maybe you can, your experience with coming to the community and how much has it impacted your, your life.
Well, and that's one of the things I love about your podcast is the way you, I think more than anyone else, so just want to engage with anyone who's out there in this community and take on all these different views. Like, oh, who's on Twitter right now? Let's jump on and chat and record. Like, that's such an amazing thing to do. We get criticized for being, this maximalist term gets thrown around, like there's an intolerant sort of attitude, or the not willing to compromise or really entertain differing views. Yeah, there's some of that. I mean, I don't even know that that's factually 100% accurate, because I think there's a lot of different ideas being thrown around. But I also think there's a real good reason behind that, which is this sort of intolerant minority, like intransient minority. And that's this idea from Nassim Taleb's books, where the example he gives is halal food. And as soon as you get it's a certain number of percent of the population who will not compromise on a certain thing, then their ideas just at a certain point infiltrate the entire majority, because it's just easier for a drink producer or food producer to make food that suits that minority. I think I'm trying to think who. I think it's Corey Klippstein from Swan Bitcoin. I've listened to him really go into detail on that, like building this intolerant minority of Bitcoiners who just will not compromise when it comes to money.
Yeah, I think anytime you get a group of people around something for which they're so passionate, you get behavior like somewhat like that. But I also think I've always been a fan of the toxicity, because I see it more as like, if you really feel like you've discovered or encountered or come to understand a truth of some kind, then I don't think you benefit from simply being accommodative for the sake of it, for the sake of being, polite or mannerly or whatever. I think inviting genuine critiques of the truth that you think you understand, that is extremely valid and valuable. And I think the community, air quotes, generally welcomes that. The kind of the discourse around disproving the truth that people think they found in this thing, but just for the sake of being, for polite society's sake, I think doesn't benefit anybody in the long term, other than some people thinking you're not as nasty as you appear.
No, I agree. I definitely. And for me, I've noticed a personal change in myself. And if I reflect on my own personality, I'm someone who's usually always wanting to be accommodating, avoiding conflict, like want to be agreeable. And I've never, I mean, I have things that I feel strongly about in my personal life or what have you, but I've never been an opinionated person particularly. I've certainly never been a political person, and I still wouldn't consider myself political in that, this path has led me down as with a lot of people, down a different path about the way you view politics and allowing you to step outside that paradigm of left versus right or this party versus another party. But yeah, for the first time, I find myself really believing in something and really caring about something and being willing to say, no, this is what I think is correct. And I'm going to stand up and push that agenda, because that's what it is. But it's not motivated by ideology. We believe it's motivated by some kind of factual truth about the world. And that's the sort of the whole premise of Austrian economics, is that there are these truths that can be deduced by their axiom. There's axioms that we can basically look at the world and say, these things are true. And then by a process of logical deduction, we arrive at other truths that we don't need data to sway us one way or the other, and that there are certain things as economic laws, and as much as a government or a politician or a group may try and bend those to their advantage, at a certain point you can't defy those economic laws.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's such a gift, I guess, really, that so many people in coming in kind of alignment with the truth that they perceive Bitcoin to represent, feeling more confident or more able or, more incentivized also in some ways to, express themselves more, because I think so many of us, and we all found our way, of course, because, you have to muddle through somehow. But, I think a lot of us in today's world, you look out on the world and maybe you're excited by some things and you're depressed by other things, and you find your groove and you find the way that works. And, that's how you get through. But to discover something that gives you such a degree of hope, and that makes so much sense, and that seems so congruent with how you had been seeing the world. I kind of look at it in a way of before Bitcoin, I think a lot of people were incongruent with the world, or let's just say, people like us, where we wanted it to be a certain way. We thought it could be a certain way. We thought it should be a certain way, but it wasn't. The representation that we were observing was totally different from that. And in most cases, it was fairly disheartening, minus, bright spots of various kinds, but on a macro level, kind of disheartening. And then to discover and align yourself with something like Bitcoin that actually makes it all make sense now, where there's a congruence is born between you and the world, and it's mediated through Bitcoin. And I know that sounds crazy to people that aren't into this, but the fact that that is true for so many is invaluable in terms of how they get up and engage with the world on a daily basis, and what their hopes and aspirations and visions for the future are. I mean, it's why we're here, right?
For sure. There's definitely something to that. And I feel it myself. Been reading this book, Ron Paul's book. I think it's End the Fed, but he wrote it. It was probably 10 years ago, around the time of his presidential campaign. And he's talking about all these ideas that we believe in around sound money. And there's something, there's something a bit depressing about looking back at the optimism that these guys had. And even I was reading another article, which was from a libertarian perspective. I think it was possibly in the 70s, talking about the Libertarian political party and how they thought that was gaining traction and engaging with the political process, and how they thought that there was a real momentum behind this idea of small government. And yeah, you think, man, like these guys were fighting this fight before we had Bitcoin, and good on them for sort of keeping the torch alive all these years where, yeah, there probably wasn't a lot of good news to hold on to. But now I think, you just can't. It's just so invigorating to actually be able to point to something concrete in the world and say, we think this is going to make a change, regardless of anyone's opinion or ideas. We think that this is an economic reality that is actually going to change the world in a good way.
Right. And, two things about that. One, that's part of the irony of the gold bugs and the Austrians who don't, who aren't into Bitcoin, because it's seemingly like this, the thing that they've been waiting for, according to their philosophies and what they've been, promoting and trying to bring about. You'd think like they would jump on it, but so many, I guess, are stuck in old modes of thinking and perhaps other things that are holding them back from understanding it. But the other thing is, like you said, it's kind of sad or depressing. And I see that too. Like even in your film, Ron Paul makes an appearance, right? And back in 2006, 7, 8, I was all over Ron Paul, right? And the Fed, that's pretty much what got me onto this line of inquiry. I saw the actual story is there's a guy in Canada known as the Prince of Pop, Mark Emery, and he was being extradited to the United States for selling seeds globally, right? And he was one of the most wanted people because he had a marijuana seed business. And it was a big injustice. And, myself as a advocate and user of weed back in the day, like I thought this was bullshit. And I saw an interview with him and he was wearing a Ron Paul t-shirt. And so I was like, well, who the fuck is Ron Paul? I look into it and, go down that rabbit hole about the Fed and how money is created and everything that Ron talks about. But it is sad when I hear the gold bugs and the libertarians talk these days, because even though they're morally more right than the people that they're in opposition to, it's almost so sad that they're begging for permission all the time. Like even going back to a gold standard, it's like yes, it may be sound money, but you're still going to have to beg for permission to have it not be corrupted and for it to be used responsibly and have it to be all the things you want it to be. And that's part of the reason why I think the Bitcoin community, to the extent that it is kind of toxic and fuck you mentality, is that way, because it doesn't require any of that. It's saying it's going to be what it is, regardless of whatever your intentions are. I don't have to ask you for anything for this to be what it is. And so, I think we all feel that. And that's why I'm sure most of us are like polite, mannerly, so, whatever, but we have this fuck you mentality that's why we're so invigorated, or one of the reasons we're so invigorated by this is we know that you can't stop it, or at least, it'd be a very big fight to stop it. And I think that's the thing that all the prior solutions were missing, because everything prior was corruptible, right? It could be stopped. It required permission. It required acquiescence, cooperation, whatever, on a level that could always be undone if, the certain things were co-opted. And I think, that's part of the reason why Bitcoiners many of us have a bit of the fuck you attitude that we do, is because we're aligned with something that basically says, fuck you. I'm going to work regardless of your permissions.
Yeah. Look, I think that's the fatal flaw of gold, that physicality of it, where, it can be, the physicality is what gives it its value, in that it can't be forged, it has to be dug out of the ground, but then it can be confiscated, it can be manipulated. And I guess, I'm a recovering gold bug myself. And I have sympathy for the people who don't understand Bitcoin, who see gold's value proposition but don't see Bitcoin's, for example. I don't have sympathy for those who come out and attack Bitcoin, and I don't think they understand it properly, but because that's, I think, taking it a step too far. But to really understand Bitcoin, I think it does require a paradigm shift. And I am now looking back on my own process of going through that and understanding it over the course of 6 months or so. Okay, you can state that there's a fixed number of Bitcoin. We know that. We know there's 21 million. Okay, people can get their head around that concept. But to understand digital scarcity and the mechanisms, the technology and the game theory and the incentives that all come together to make that work, and for us to be able to say with such confidence that digital scarcity has been invented or discovered, and it so definitively rests within Bitcoin, not anything else. I don't think that's an easy thing to understand at all. Like it takes a long time and a willingness to look at things from a different angle to really get that. So, I understand that people aren't immediately receptive to it, because I think it is a mind-bending concept.
It's definitely a paradigm shift. There's no doubt about that. And so to the extent that that's what's keeping certain people back, then, of course, you got to accept that. And, time, maybe all that's required is time. But I do feel like some of the gold bugs, I think they maybe kind of betray a, like somewhat of a narrow understanding of money, because I feel like if they had a better understanding, they would at least be excited by the prospect of what Bitcoin supposes or is claims to represent. If they really kind of understood the lever that is money and all the different things that it influences and the mechanism that it represents for human interaction, I feel if someone came across their desk and was like, well, something's emerged that has these properties, even if they can't understand how those properties are compiled and how they're upheld, I would think that if they really got money, they'd say, now that's interesting. I should look into that. But I think a lot of them are still dismissive,
I think you're correct that if someone who has a pro-gold, anti-Bitcoin stance, if you really dig deeper into that, I agree, you'll probably find some kind of misunderstanding of money at a fundamental level. I agree.
Yeah, I was listening to Pomp and Peter Schiff briefly last night or whenever it was, and Peter just droning on about gold being used in semiconductors and jewelry. And I mean, it's a farce at this point, but sometimes it's fun to watch for a little while. Why don't we just bring it back to your experience? Because this tell me kind of when it clicked for you. You said it's only been roughly a year. What was the process for you?
Well, the first thing that makes you sit up and take notice of Bitcoin is definitely the price. If you've got no idea of it other than that, that's just what makes you notice it. And so I think the first thing is to buy a little bit, even if you don't understand it, which I don't think you will at first. I think you've still got to get skin in the game in order to get that motivation, even if it's only $100 or some tiny amount, and then you can
100%.
go down that process. So I think for me, it was really trying to unravel these technical concepts that I think you have to understand. You do have to understand them, I think, before you can really have 100% confidence in Bitcoin. Like, it's just something as simple. Well, it's not simple. Something like public key cryptography. I think it's important to understand that. Like, and a lot of the technical books on Bitcoin, even the simple books, will explain it and say, okay, we've got a public key and a private key. The public key is the key that you share. It can be out in the public domain, but it is what unlocks the message. But no one tries to go into the mathematics behind that at all. They just present the system and sort of that's taken as given, and then you move on to the next step. But I think unless you can actually have some understanding of how the mathematics protects that, I think that's important. And we were discussing the sovereign individual last week, and I think they actually do a really good job of that, just with this concept of multiplication and division. And it's easier to multiply two numbers together. It's much harder to divide them back out and find the original inputs. And that asymmetry there, I think, is an important aspect of what makes that technology powerful. And Bitcoin doesn't really use this prime number factorization. It uses the elliptical curve, but I still think the multiplication versus division asymmetry is a really good starting point to at least get the most fundamental aspect of that. And then the same thing with hash functions like that. Like hash functions are not an intuitive concept at all. Like they don't make any sense, I think, when you first look at them. So that's the next thing that takes some time to understand. And that hash functions, I think, are explained quite well in the literature about Bitcoin. But those two things are fundamental, I think, to understanding the digital scarcity concept.
So when you say you were brought in by Number Go Up, was this like the run to 14 last spring, or just the history of Bitcoin Number Go Up?
It was probably plan B. Hearing about his model was what first got me interested in Bitcoin.
How'd you hear about it?
I heard about it on, I think it was on the Investors podcast, on Preston Pish's podcast. I reckon that was the first time I actually heard enough about Bitcoin to take it seriously. I'd heard about it in the 2017 run. And so people are obviously, there's debate about that model. People are skeptical, but I think you look at it and say, well, if this has got a 1% chance of being right, then it's worth looking into it. And so, and that's the other thing I don't understand about this adamant opposition to Bitcoin. It's like, okay, if you don't understand it, but you see the price, like you can see, there's no debate about the fact that it's the best performing asset of the last decade. So to reflect on that fact and then say, no, I'm still going to, especially if you're a money manager or something, and say, no, I'm still going to not recommend that in the slightest, like that, I think belies some kind of ulterior motive. I mean, yeah, the price alone should be enough reason to make a small allocation to it.
Yeah, totally. And, as for the opposition to Bitcoin, especially in the financial community, and I haven't had enough of these conversations to really get a sense for, kind of what the general perspective is. But I mean, if you kind of accept the inherent faults of how the monetary system works today, and I don't think that's a very difficult case to make, although to some minds it is, but money can't be created out of thin air. Should it be exclusively in the realm and hands and control of governments? What are the downstream effects of that being the case? These are pretty easy to delineate arguments and cause effect relationships. And if they buy into those, as you said, like I can't imagine at least not thinking and exploring, well, what are the alternatives that might be a response to this? Like, are we just going to accept that everything is totally fucked and there's nothing to do about it? Or, okay, things are fucked. What out there might unfuck us to whatever degree? And maybe you look at gold and Bitcoin and whatever, is on your kind of, is in front of you. But it is strange that people dismiss it so out of hand. But look, I couldn't be more happy that people have dismissed it this long, because it buys all of us more time,
It's hard to take a step back and look at this objectively, but I think there has been this Overton window shift in the last, this year, with the virus and the economic crisis. I mean, we're talking about this stuff every day, so maybe we've got this different perspective and it's hard for us to see. But I think we saw the cover of The Economist just last week with a machine spouting money out into the air. So I think there is this idea of what is money, and governments printing money is seeping into the mainstream narrative in a way that I think it wasn't even a year ago, even in the decade since the 2008 crisis. I really just don't think that was part of the conversation. And I think that when I talk to people who aren't interested in any of this stuff, just the simple fact that central banks create money from nothing, I don't think a lot of people still understand that concept. Like that's even that taking that step to realize that is happening, even though I'm about to say the facts are not hidden, but it is hidden. I think the reason that the process is so convoluted, where you get, okay, they're not running printing presses, they're issuing bonds which are purchased by commercial banks well, the government's issuing the bonds are purchased by the commercial banks, the central bank then purchases those, these open market operations. Like it's hard to understand. I remember trying to read about this process in economics, my economics class when I was at school, because economics, I loved economics. I loved the concept of it. I was really into it. And I still remember sitting at my desk doing my homework. I'm like 17 years old or something, reading about the way that central banks control interest rates, and just scratching my head saying, I just don't understand this process. Like, why is it so complicated? So I think it's complicated for a reason. And so, yeah, I just don't think people understand that fact. And even if they do, there's still a prevailing belief that the money supply should be increased. Whether it's that monetarist Milton Friedman idea that it increases by a certain amount per year. It increases in line with the population. It has to be increased or decreased in opposition to the business cycle. That's still a very widely held belief. And this idea that there should be a fixed supply of money, like this, and that money will then inherently be deflationary. That is still not accepted as a good idea by a lot of people. And I think you read some of the writings of people in the early days of the cypherpunks like Nick Szabo, or talks about when he was trying to develop BitGold as a precursor to Bitcoin. He says not many people, even in the cypherpunks, thought what I was doing was a good idea, and even from an economic point of view, I guess the theory behind it. And people like Wei Dai, who his project B Money, which was another precursor to Bitcoin, like he still in recent years has looked at Bitcoin and said, I'm not convinced that this hard cap was the right thing to do. And I think Szabo even says the same thing. Like he's not even 100% sure that absolutely limiting the supply of money is the right idea. So it's interesting that, it's not an intuitive idea, and it's not a widely held popular belief. But I think for me, it's over the course of my journey, it's become clear that it is a good idea, and I guess I'm working on that pitch to try and explain why a fixed supply of money is the correct way to do money. I suppose there is common sense behind it. Like, that more money doesn't create more stuff. I think that simple common sense approach in the end hopefully will win out.
Yeah. I mean, I'm totally with you that into the lexicon of today's global culture, or, in most major economies, has slipped the idea and concept of money printing, right? I mean, it's so overt now. You've got Fed chair and, other people from the Fed, basically saying on national syndicated television that, yes, we're printing as much money as required. All we need to do is press a keystroke and, we've got all the money we need. And that's starting to seep through. Most of the people that I speak to haven't a clue about the history of money and the role of money and how money works and the different monetary options, et cetera. But they've heard the word money printing and they scratch their head and go, where does it come from? Whatever, what's on TV? But like, it's in there, it's percolating, it's marinating a little bit. And, to your point about the money supply, that's an odd one to me. So for, the monetary theorists and, gold bugs, it's even very common amongst them and I think it's because the thing that they've hung their cap on has an inflation rate. And so they have to kind of support it. They have to say like that it's good, because they'd be kind of, discrediting their own argument if they said, well, the thing I'm promoting has a 2% inflation rate, but it would be better not to have any inflation at all. And I think now that may not be conscious for most of them. They may just think they've been taught, they've grown up, they think gold has a 2% inflation rate and all the other goods about it like that is good. But it's so strange to me because, and you said you've been working on a pitch, I'd love to hear it, or hear what, you know, people like Szabo and others who said maybe we need to increase it. But to me, it's just, if you increase the money supply, you're engaging in an act of theft from the holders of money. If you allow the price of money to adjust in response to demand, then you're allowing the market, the dictates of the market, to either penalize or reward the holders of money. That seems like a far more meritocratic or fair arrangement than, you know, determining, you know, not only you know, achieving some notion of stability, which is highly contentious in itself, by expanding the money supply, but of course it begs the question, who's going to be in control of that? And then you've got a whole other kettle of fish that you have to contend with in terms of, you know, who should wield that power, and can they do so responsibly, and can they, you know, will they not be corrupted, and blah, 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 all the way down the line. I don't understand why so many people think that in order to achieve, and also I've spoken with some of these types, gold bugs and other people that promote the expansion of the money supply for price stability. And then they criticize Bitcoin for its volatility. I mean, it's the most obvious thing in the world that as something monetizes, as it's in the middle of its distribution amongst, you know, people of the world, that of course it's going to be highly volatile. It can't come out of the box and be a perfectly stable unit of account, for example. But when it is fully distributed and when it is broadly in use, then its volatility should be evened out and it should roughly reflect the changes in productivity and market demand. And that's the way that I think it should be. And it's almost disingenuous that they bring up that argument like, oh, Bitcoin's so volatile, it could never be a unit of account and we need some inflation for the price stability. I'm like, first of all, at this point, Bitcoin's lack of 2% inflation is not what's causing its volatility. What's causing its volatility is its distribution right now. And yes, the speculative nature in which that occurs. But I feel they're being disingenuous and or exceedingly incompetent in their assessment of how these things play out. But, you know, what have you come up with in terms of a pitch about that?
Well, I really like the way Vijay Boyapati explains this in the bullish case for Bitcoin, his article, and I've listened to him on a lot of different interviews. And he says, we've never seen this process of the monetization of a good play out in our lifetime. I mean, I guess fiat money, like government-backed paper money, is it's not a recent invention. It's been around for a long time, but the most recent era of fiat money, I guess, has happened over a couple of generations. But yeah, the monetization of Bitcoin is potentially following a similar path to the way gold became money millennia ago, but that was a process that took place over potentially thousands of years, whereas now we're looking at the same process play out, but sped up over a much faster period, because I think there is something to this thesis that history speeds up just in general, and technology plays a role in that. So it's hard to find a historical parallel. And Vijay also says that people who focus on volatility or focus on these other aspects of Bitcoin miss the fact that when it comes to money and a good becoming money, store of value has to come first. Like that is the traditional economic analysis of money is that money is a medium of exchange, like the generally accepted medium of exchange. That is the defining characteristic of money. But in Vijay's analysis, he will say it can't become a medium of exchange until it's a generally accepted store of value. Like that process has to come first. And so, yeah, it doesn't really make sense to spend Bitcoin right now. I mean, there are other reasons why you'd want to spend Bitcoin, but you certainly would want to be replacing that Bitcoin as soon as you've spent it. And that until that process of Bitcoinization happens, like that has to come first. And as you say, that has to come with volatility. That's just an inevitable part of the process. So I really like that way of looking at things like this Bitcoin as store of value. That's what we're watching play out now, and that's inevitable and necessary and a good thing. And I just pick up on one other thing you said before at the start of that about gold, which I agree 100% with, is that, yeah, it's hard to tease out what it was that really made what made gold a good money. And you look at gold and see its inflation rate of maybe 1 or 2%. And so perhaps the traditional view of that has been, yeah, gold is great money because it inflates at a low but stable rate of 1 to 2%, and that's in line with economic growth, or that's in line with population growth, and that's a really good thing. Whereas, in fact, and I think it's the Bitcoin Standard and Saifedean's analysis that has been most influential here in making us all really understand this. He says, no, that's not the reason why gold was money, the best money. The reason is because it's not because it was 1 or 2%. It's because it was the closest to zero that we could get. And zero is actually the best thing you want in money, zero inflation. And Bitcoin is now the closest thing we've got to that. In fact, it achieves that. In the long term, it's got this asymptotic money supply growth that hits a hard stop. And that's actually the thing that defines good money. But it's a scary concept because we're so conditioned to think of deflation as bad. Still, that I think for just about everyone, that is a scary concept to know that we've got this hard cap on money. If Bitcoin were to become the generally accepted money, it's going to be deflationary. Prices are going to fall over time, and that has been so drummed into our heads that that's a bad thing and that's detrimental to economic growth. And so unraveling that and understanding that actually the opposite is true. Like you said, the purchasing power of money just adjusts whether positively or negatively to people's preference for the amount of money they hold, and allowing that process to play out naturally rather than having someone meddle in it, I think is definitely the best way to do it.
Yeah. It's just always been so funny because, the inflation rate is effectively the difficulty in producing more of a given substance, right? In conjunction with the broader demand for it. And you find a harmony there between the two. But it's, like, as you said, it's not that the 1 to 2% of like difficulty in obtaining something. So it was so hard, you could only create 1 to 2% more of it, per year. Was like some written in the sky, written in the stone tablets, like truth of money, as you said, or which Saif said. It was the closest approximation to the ideal. The ideal would be that you couldn't create any more, but that it was still usable in money because of its other properties of divisibility and transportability and transactability, etc. But people get stuck in their ways, I suppose, and everyone represents their interests. And if you're a gold bug, you've probably got a lot of gold. And notwithstanding, I think because of the kind of slow process of people appreciating what we've just articulated, so I think gold will benefit from the lag time of people appreciating that, i.e., it'll probably pump in the environment that we're heading into now. I think I don't think it holds a candle to Bitcoin. And I think ultimately Bitcoin probably replaces it for, at least all of its monetary uses.
Yeah, I think so, and I hope so. I certainly don't. I believe that, but I guess there's always risks I think every risk to Bitcoin that is known and articulated has a really good rebuttal. Right. But there are always potentially risks that we just don't know exist yet. Right. So I think, I think gold will have a role for a long time to come. But yeah, from a conceptual point of view, I think Bitcoin is better than gold in just about every sense. And this idea of deflationary money or a fixed money supply, I think Seyfried articulates it really well, and the stock to flow concept is, I think, a really gives really good clarity to it. But it's not a new idea. I mean, it's been around. If you read Mises or these Austrian economics who were writing earlier last century, they made that very clear that money, the best money supply is a fixed money supply, but I think the Keynesian idea, which then morphed into the monetarist idea of manipulating the money supply, became the economic paradigm that was most widely accepted by governments. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. That was done. That the Keynesian model was promoted deliberately, yes, but I think just because if you're in a position of power and government, that's a narrative that is really has a ring to your ears. First of all, that you have the ability to control things, and that your control will change the global economy for the better. Like, they're nice things for a government to hear. Like, you don't really want to hear the fact that actually things would be much better if you just didn't do anything. So yeah, I think there's definitely truth to this idea that Keynesian economics is hand in glove with big government and statism, and that there's a kind of intellectual, I don't want to say class, but like our academic institutions promote that version of economics because they receive their funding in the majority from the government. And this, without anyone consciously running a conspiracy theory, the incentives just align for this version of the world to promote itself in a feedback loop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we were discussing in the Sovereign Individual Book Club, even though I believe that to be the case, and it serves the short-term agendas and perhaps preferences of both, government and the people, the constituents who are seeking, things from government, there reaches a point where that system is no longer sustainable. And that's the $64 million question, around the world these days is, are we seeing the cracks of that emerge? And I mean, I think it's difficult to argue that we're not, but timing is always the tricky thing with all of this, and what kind of creative and or authoritarian measures can be enacted to, prolong this system longer than you might otherwise think it would naturally exist for. And the other thing is as the book suggests about the role of technology for changing the logic of violence, and that's actually what mediates the large structural changes in society and culture and civilization, rather than the good idea from a charismatic person or the will of the people or whatever it might be. I think it's going to be the case. I think Bitcoin will continue to do its thing over the years, but it will just simply have to assert its economic truth over time until it's the dominant economic truth. Because we tend to think that if people only knew how fucked up the money system was, as Henry Ford said, there'd be riots in the street, if people understood how our banking system worked. Or actually, I think that's in your film too, right? That quote. But, we think, oh, people would be up in arms. No, they wouldn't. Most people don't fucking care, because, I mean, they don't think about it on the level that we do, and they don't devote the time to it as we do. So, like, people tend to think like, well, that when this system crashes, or if the dollar is done away with and it's a special drawing right basket, or if it's a new central bank digital currency or whatever, that like then people will wake up and be like, no, you're not going to fool me twice, government. Yes, they will. Because most people have they don't feel that they're being stolen from now with a monetary inflation rate of 8, 10, 15, 20, 25% in the current climate. They kind of go to the grocery store, and if things are a little bit more expensive, they whine about it to their, wife or husband when they get home, and then they go on about their business. And we look at these places where things have been drawn, far past what we think would be tolerable from a population, in a place like Venezuela. And yes, there's crime and there's poverty and there's this and there's that, but like it's still hobbling together. And I wonder, like, even if I wonder, this is so obvious to us, but I wonder, even if it was obvious to a lot of other people, would they care? Like what's gonna cause them to care? We're preemptively caring because we think there's individual benefit to be derived, and we want to give this thing gasoline because we want to expedite the emergence of this thing in the world because we know of the good that it represents. But I don't know. I just like things are bad now. Like the money supply in Canada has grown by 15% in the last year. In the US, it's been 25%. Like that means that if you're a holder of cash, that money that you have has lost a commensurate amount of value. Whether that's represented in prices immediately is pretty much irrelevant. It takes time for them to be represented. Deflationary, pressures will mean that it won't be represented in the prices of certain goods, but your cash balances have been diluted by that amount. And that's not top of mind for most people. So I do wonder, even if it becomes even more obvious, will people care?
Yeah, I think you're getting at the real crux of the matter. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, because, you read Seyfried's book and the thesis is hard money wins. That's kind of that sums up his historical analysis basically over the millennia, that hard money will eventually come to dominate a money that has a higher inflation rate. And so I read that and understood it and think it's correct, but it's really, I guess, a purely economic analysis, because when you look at the world today, you're like, okay, we have fiat money, we have government sponsored worthless paper money, so that's winning in the simplest analysis. And why is that the case? Why did that sort of take over from gold? I mean, it necessarily built on top of gold, but has now detached itself from gold and is the dominant form of money because it is the generally accepted medium of exchange. And I couldn't get my head around that for a while until I realized, or the way I now approach it, is that fiat money cannot be explained with economic analysis. It can only be explained with a political analysis, and that is an analysis of the use of the threat of force. It's basically unthinkable. Fiat money is not thinkable as a concept without the threat of force behind it. It's basically the monopolist on violence, which is the government, and that's a whole different argument as to whether that monopoly is legitimate or not in terms of police or military or whatever. But when it comes to money, it's them enforcing their system of money on a free market that would probably choose a very different form of money if the free market was left to itself and you could have a purely economic analysis. So I think that's the money system that we use today owes itself much more to the politics of violence than it does to pure economic analysis. And so you're asking, the million-dollar question, which is, how will Bitcoin change the future? And because Bitcoin is obviously Bitcoin is this pure representation of the free market. It's got no agenda. It's got no threat of violence behind it. It's just this pure manifestation of a free market force. And are we gonna see that come head to head with the state, like the manifestation of the political means, the monopolist on violence? We're going to see those two things clash. And our hope, I guess, is that the economic force of Bitcoin is so strong that it actually overcomes the threat of force of the state. And that, I guess, that's this thesis of the sovereign individual. They say that, or they believe that is what's going to happen, that these forces that Bitcoin have come to represent, the technological forces, computer processing, have this impact on the way violence pays. According to their analysis, that force that Bitcoin represents is so strong that it's actually going to overcome the force of the state, and we may hopefully get to this future where we have free money. And I think if you really believe in Bitcoin, you would also have to say that we don't necessarily impose a Bitcoin standard on the world. It's just that people should be free to choose their own form of money. And if we happen to think that they'll probably choose Bitcoin if given a choice. But that's the most important point, is that there's no meddling in the free market's right to choose in any commodity, money or otherwise.
Yeah. And I guess it's an extension of the phenomena that gold bugs have been pondering for the last, 5 decades, is that, how come people don't because presumably from their worldview, people should have been freaking out that money was now, worthless paper, untethered to any form of work that puts any sort of restriction on its supply and how much of it there can be, and thus in the preservation of the value that it stores for you as an individual. How come people aren't freaking out about that? But the fact is they weren't. Nobody gave a fuck. And I think, I'm sure there's many reasons for this, and some were overt intentional strategies by the people behind that system to conceal that fact, and other parts that are far in which they're far less complicit. And I feel like most people don't really care about losing value. They care about gaining value, right? When people think about investing, the average person, if you're a portfolio manager, you manage risk and you look at your downside, you're obviously much more methodical about it, and you consider downside risk, and that helps you position your portfolio and all the rest of it. But for the average Joe and Jane, when they consider deploying capital, they're not doing so trying to preserve value. They're saying, how can I make more money? How can I be richer? This is the kind of frame of reference or the mindset that people have. And so I think they're just tuned to focus almost all of their attention at price going up. That's what's relevant to them. Price going down, or value going down rather, so something even more abstract than price, which is value. So it's much harder to ascertain when it's actually happening because it's not in your face. That's not something that people are either trained to observe or come in contact with on a daily basis because of that. So their primary consideration is for growth, I guess is what I'm saying, but not just growth in the economic sense, but in things moving forward, things moving up. That's, offense rather than defense, I guess, right? It's offense that wins the game. And I think that's because what could be a more egregious fact than the US dollar is losing 98 point whatever percent of its value since its inception? I mean, holy fucking shit. That should be big news to anybody who transacts and presumes to store wealth in the US dollar. But it's not. Nobody gives a fuck, because there's an ignorance level, of course, and there's also an attitude of, well, all I need to do is make more money. I need to make price go up and wherever I'm deploying that capital, and that fixes all other problems, which is actually accurate until it doesn't anymore, until the problem gets away from you, and no amount of price go up can make up for value go down.
Yeah, it's just death by a thousand cuts. You're right that people don't, over the course of a lifetime, you don't really notice the money losing its value. But I think there's this fundamental, you're talking about people conditioned to needing to see the value of their investment go up. I agree with, and I think there's this fundamental problem when it comes to the way we view money in the bank, because that's where most people are holding their savings, and then if you feel like you've got enough savings to take some risk, you're then moving some of that money into some kind of investment, be that into shares or what have you. But people are conditioned to think that they deserve to earn interest on their money in the bank. But on the other hand, they think that money is 100% safe, guaranteed, that can never lose its nominal value. But those two ideas are not logically compatible when you really think about it. If you've got savings that you put in the bank that is guaranteed, no risk, access it whenever you want, that can't by definition earn interest, because interest and risk are synonymous. Like, you can't earn interest without risking loss of capital in some respect. So instead of, so the government that I guess creates the system of money that we operate in, instead of recognizing that basic fact, they say, no, you can have your money in the bank, you're going to earn interest on it, and then we're going to insure that deposit with our deposit insurance scheme. So you've got guaranteed money, access to it whenever you want. It's guaranteed by this deposit scheme, but you're also earning interest. So people assume that to be a very normal thing, when in fact it's a completely nonsensical thing once you actually stop and think about it. And that means that everything else that you project from that point is sort of doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so, yeah, that's I think an important point to understand, but it's also a difficult path to go down, understanding how commercial banking fits into all this. Like, it's easy enough for us to look at central bank balance sheets and the fact that they're expanding. But yeah, on the other side of the coin, commercial banks are restricting the amount of credit that they're lending out. So you've got this crazy deflationary force moving in the opposite direction to the central banks who are trying to inflate. And it's really the commercial banks, because of this money multiplier, that the commercial banks have their deposits with the central bank, and they then lend on top of that as a fraction of the reserve ratio. So that sort of rubber band of credit is like going crazy up and down. And that, I think, those waves are what are really influencing what's going on in the real economy. Whereas the central bank is increasing the base money supply right now, and that's probably actually not having that much effect right now. In fact, people who are holding money, like physical dollars, are potentially seeing their purchasing power go up, not in relation to financial assets. But, well, certainly in March, we saw this when there was the stock market crash and a real credit crunch, a liquidity crisis, and a run to the US dollar. So those dollars were actually, even though the central banks were beginning their process of inflating the base money supply, those dollars were actually increasing in value. And now we've gotten past that, and we're seeing, the reverse happen. But yeah, it's really hard to tease out the second order effects. And that's why I think something like modern monetary theory gets a real look in, because it says, no, let's just keep inflating the money supply. Let's give people money, universal basic income. I mean, they just look at the consumer price index and say, hey, we're not seeing any inflation. So there's no consequence. Let's just print money and give it to people, and everyone will be rich. And whereas we come at it from a different angle and say, yeah, okay, there's actually all these second and third order effects and potential future effects that you're not actually taking into account. But most people don't give much weight to unseen consequences, unfortunately, but they're still very real.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, it's the monetary and financial system has become so convoluted and complex that, on top of the already apathetic attitude that most people have with regards to these things, and I think you can make a strong case that the kind of monolithic representation that the state has become has really dialed up the apathy in most people for a great many things. But you layer on top of that the complexity and convoluted nature of the financial and monetary system, and people are just like, what the fuck ever. This beyond me. I'm not, which is a shame, because it needn't be complex at all. Really at its core, it could be really damn simple if you have a good, true money at the foundation of it, which is obviously we think that's what Bitcoin represents. But and people shouldn't have to understand these things in order to store their value, right? You shouldn't have to be able to comprise a risk-adjusted portfolio, blah blah blah, in order to just take your surplus from your labor and put it in a vehicle that will maintain it or increase its value moderately over time. Like that seems like something that should be default. But to your point about, the UBI and MMT argument, like instead of trying to understand the convoluted nature of how it exists now, I feel like it would be great if we could just operate on principles. Should people be able to steal money from you surreptitiously without your knowledge in whatever amounts they see fit? Do you think that is fair? And you would think that in a rational society, most people would say no. But one of the really scary things about the world and the society we're living in today is that simple principled questions like that are being answered in the affirmative, as in, yes, and of course, usually it's not in reference to themselves. Like if you say, should I be able to steal your money? Someone would say no. But if you expand it to a social level, you say, should this group of people be able to take that group of people's money in order to do X, Y, Z with it? Yeah, they should. And not only is that the answer, but the discourse around these things, and we mentioned this in the Sovereign Individual book club chat, has degraded to such a degree that you're almost, there's very little rational discourse around these things. It's very polarized. It's very emotionally charged. And as the book predicts, it predicts that is how things will look. That will be the appearance of the discourse and how things will unfold as the existing system goes through its transformation from one to the other. But, and again, this is why I have these conversations on this pod, to kind of do my little piece to try to have these conversations that bring a little bit more logic and reason to these discussions. But you combine the apathy with the kind of disallowing of rational discourse around these things and the irrational approach to people's property and their assets. It's a recipe for a shit soup, pretty much.
Well, there is this, I think, a fundamental problem with the way the democratic process works, which is that it's basically, it does seem to inevitably become a vehicle for the redistribution of wealth. And that's why I find Hans Hermann Hoppe, his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, such a compelling book, because it puts forward such a convincing case that democracy has a fatal flaw. Now, that's a dangerous thing to say in today's environment. That's like prime for getting yourself cancelled to question democracy. And in fact, he was, I think, fired from his position, university position. But look, we have to, I think, in the name of getting at the truth, I don't think anything should be off limits. I think we have to have these discussions. So, yeah, look, that's why I think I'm so fascinated by the anarcho-capitalist point of view, saying that no matter where you start from in terms of how you try and limit the powers of a government, and which is why I think the American experiment is such a fascinating thing to see it, the way it's played out over several hundred years, that there's this inevitable creep as you try and limit the powers, but it's almost just inevitable the way government grows, because it's so easy to promise, it's so easy to make promises. And I see it myself, like I'm sure it's happening in Canada. You're seeing these stimulus checks being written out in the US, same things happening here in Australia, where the government is basically in order to fudge the unemployment figures, the government has just started paying employers to pay wages to their employees. So even if your business is not earning any money, even if you would otherwise go out of business, the government just pays you, you keep paying your employees. It doesn't matter if they're actually doing work or not. Yeah. And then there are also grants to just receive money in your bank account. I mean, that is a compelling, even for me, like I can't actually, I'd love to be able to say I'm principled enough to stand there. At me as an employer, I'd love to say I'm principled enough to say I'm not going to take that money. But you just got to operate within the paradigm that is presented to you, unfortunately, and you can see why, as much as you can understand in principle, why it's a bad idea. You have no choice but to play the game that's presented to you. I don't think it ends well down the track.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what all this is about is, very seldom are people better than their incentives. And why, knowing, even though you're a critic of it, you do yourself harm by not availing of these ridiculous policies that are being enacted. So of course, whether it's a UBI check or employment subsidy or whatever, of course you've got to take it. Now, hopefully you're using it in the most, sensible or smart way that you can, i.e. buying as much Bitcoin with it as you can. But, don't hate the player, hate the game, right? That's always
that makes it okay. You put it straight to Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. But hold on, I'm just realizing I put a beer in the freezer to cool it down. So I'm going to go grab that.
Oh, man.
And then I want to talk a little bit about the film. I'll be right back.
Sweet.
Not frozen. We're good. Cheers.
You got it in time? Nice.
Oh, there's a few ice crystals in there.
Looks good. I'm still in coffee mode here. Early morning.
But yeah, just on the final point on that is like, man, there's so much intervention, so much supramarket, so much government level intervention in markets. And I just wonder, how long can we push back the tide of, extreme price distortions, extreme misallocation of capital leading to extreme market and productive inefficiencies? Like, how long can this go on? And, in 2008, I was of the mind like, oh, this is happening now. Like, this is the kind of collapse of the system. And it wasn't. And I wonder if the kind of maybe perhaps recency bias or just the experience of 2008 is leading a lot of people to think, this is really bad, but it's probably going to take 5, 10, 15 before it gets really, really bad. Is that causing them to misjudge this? And could this get really, really bad really, really quickly?
You do wonder about that. And yes, you can't underestimate their ability to sort of kick the can down the road. I, for one, have been guilty of calling it too early. I remember years ago, you look at Japan and the fact that they, the craziness of their budget deficits, the fact that their central bank owns 3/4 of the stock market, and you say this is a perfect recipe for a currency collapse. And people would talk about how you can trade that, like it's a given. Like there's just no way they can keep this up, and yet they've kept it going. The yen has still not lost its value as a currency relatively to all the other currencies. I mean, because it's kind of like this giant race to the bottom where everyone's on a road to devaluing their currency. But look, you have to think that we're getting closer to the end, this kind of end game. And I really like Preston Pish's analysis on this. He talks about that he thinks this is, Ray Dalio has this model of short-term debt cycles and long-term debt cycles that play out over 80 years or so, and that we're in a cycle that began during the Second World War and the Bretton Woods Agreement that set up the monetary system we're in today, and we're potentially seeing the end of that now. Why now rather than 10 years ago or in the 2008 crisis? Well, now you're at this point where almost every central bank in the world has their interest rates pinned at pretty much 0%. The US was basically the last holdout of positive interest rates. They're getting really close to zero now. And he would say the reason that Japan has been able to keep this up for so long is that although they've had negative interest rates, we live in a global system, and the capital has had somewhere to flow to receive a yield. Whereas now there's no yield to be had anywhere. We're getting negative yield imposed in a lot of places. Banks, pension funds who are by law and regulation required to hold these government bonds that are going to have negative yields imposed on them. At a certain point, that just stops being an attractive proposition for anybody. And that's when you start looking at gold, for example. Why would I hold a negative yielding bond when I could hold gold and Bitcoin for the same reasons? Although people who are more conservative would be slower to come around to seeing that Bitcoin is the same proposition. Mm-hmm. But eventually, now that everything's at zero, there's nowhere to go. They can't raise interest rates basically ever within the confines of the current paradigm. I just can't see how that can happen. Like the US tried to do that a couple of years ago, and it just didn't work. We're back to pretty much zero. So that is the sign of a system that doesn't have that long to play out.
Yeah. You know, I think what we're talking about is we don't know how long the narrative can survive because, you know, maybe the next decade is deep negative rates, UBI and lots of money printing, distortions everywhere, but financial assets increasing in price, you know, basically an exacerbation of the last 10 years. And maybe that narrative holds over the next decade. I doubt it, but it's certainly possible. But what I know for sure is that however long the narrative plays out, and for the system to reach a quote unquote breaking point that people identify as such, what I'm sure about is the reality, the economic reality of what these interventions do will play out and are playing out from the moment they do them. And what I'm referring to is the inequality and the unrest that they foster. And so if we've seen a certain amount over the last 10 years, and we've just done as much intervention over the last 4 or 5 months as has happened over the last 10 years, if not more, then we're going to see 10x the inequality, 10x the unrest, 10x of all the problems that occur when, as a result of this type of policy towards money and the monetary system and monetary policy and also fiscal policy. But so, you know, AKA, you know, watch yourself, right? Because things will probably get, you know, the system may hold together, and people on CNN and Fast Money and all the rest of it will say, you know, stocks are up, and, you know, let's talk about the presidential race, or how bad the president is, or, you know, a war in this part of the world, to just, you know, and everyone will be distracted. But it's inconceivable to me that it doesn't continue to degrade at an accelerating rate in terms of the social problems that we've seen over the last, 30, 40 years. And especially
I think for sure it probably gets worse before it gets better. But this is the reason I really like Jeff Booth's book, The Price of Tomorrow, is that he talks about deflation and how deflation is actually a good thing. And the only thing that's holding us back right now is governments imposing an inflationary monetary system on us. And if we could somehow find a way to shift that paradigm and accept deflation for what it is and why it's good. And we've talked a bit about monetary deflation, but he comes at it more from a technological point of view, saying technology is inherently deflationary, and the strength and speed of that force is accelerating like crazy. And so that will allow people to be better off. It just means deflation means you get more stuff for less money. It's not a hard sell, and that's a good thing.
Prices are going down. Why is it so hard?
But unfortunately, that means that if you allow that system to run its course freely without intervention, it does create a hierarchy where you do get these winner take all effects, and you get people at the top. You get rewards flowing to people at the top, but at the same time, in a deflationary, a deflationary system, and a system where technology is allowed to just like the sovereign individual thesis, where as assets become digital and become intangible, these network effects, like in professional sports, you see the top guys, the top few people making all the money,
right.
or in on the internet, you see all the value being captured by this small percentage of big companies at the top, or in the entertainment industry, it's a few actors making all the money. Those kind of network effects playing out, but in a relative terms, you're seeing inequality, but in absolute terms, everyone is actually better off. They're better off than they would be compared to themselves under the old system. So it's scary for middle-class America to look at the fact that their jobs are becoming obsolete. But if you just allow the market forces to run, okay, you might be done out of a job, but your standard of living may actually increase to the point where you can have a better standard of living and only work 20 hours a week or something. If that's not like the future that we're working towards, what are we working towards? Like, why are we still working 50-hour weeks? Why do both parents have to hold down a high-paying job in order to meet a reasonable standard of living in a household? And I think inflationary policies that are imposed upon us definitely have had a role to play in why that's happened.
Oh, a huge role, man. History is going to look back on this and is going to correctly, characterize it as one of the greatest detrimental parasites that humanity ever imposed on itself. I mean, people are working more than ever. There's more mental health issues than ever. There's rising poverty. There's like on so many different metrics of individual well-being. We're doing horribly, and we shouldn't be, right? Because we've got more technology at our disposal than ever. And, we haven't met the carrying capacity of the earth, and, all sorts of things should be in our favor, but we've got a giant parasite sucking so much of that benefit away from the vast majority of the people. And to your point about, the hierarchy, but, obviously those develop in all systems, right? There's always going to be a natural hierarchy that develops. The thing that's encouraging about hierarchies that develop under a sound money system, and is why I don't like, the socialist types, decry or fear monger about monopolies, et cetera, is that, capitalist monopolies may very well be a big question, or a problem in a fiat money system, because once you get to a certain size and scale, you've got the ability to, the regulatory capturability to maintain your position through supramarket maneuvers, i.e. buying politicians and funding politicians and funding regulations and pricing out competitors through those regulations, et cetera. But if it's on a sound money system that can't be manipulated, then someone who's achieved a highly dominant market position, there's two things that happen. First, they can only accrue value based on the merit that the market provides them. So one, it's entirely fair, and two, they don't have an endless supply of resources to continue maintaining their position at the top. They've got to spend into it, and it's entirely possible, as has there's many examples of this, that competitors find a hole in the market, they serve the market better, and there's a natural flux that emerges, but and all the more in a more technological economy, right? The technology and the innovation causes a lot of churn at the top, because you become so big and you kind of solidify your position, and then you have a blind spot for an emerging technology or an emerging trend or what have you, and this creates churn. So we've just got to accept that everyone starts at different places. Everyone has different privileges. Everyone has just different strengths and weaknesses. And yes, I'd love to have been born Jeff Bezos's kid, or the Prince of England, or, a Chinese emperor, or whatever. Like we all have we can't all start from the same place, but we can all play the same game in as fair a manner as possible, all playing by the same rules. That's all we can ask for. And if that's the case, you just, you got to accept what happens. Some people are going to be more successful than you, and some people are going to be less successful than you. And, you'll have to, there'll be some tough pills to swallow. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but more or less you get out of it what you put into it. And that's all we can ask for as a species, as a civilization, to play a game that has those rules.
Absolutely. I think that, a level playing field, a game that offers equal opportunity to everyone is the best that you can ask for. You can't really try and manipulate equality of outcome. But the counterintuitive thing is that to achieve the level playing field, the way to do that is actually to remove the restrictions and the regulations and the manipulations,
right,
and the interventions that are trying to equal things out. They end up having the opposite effect. And you're talking about monopolies in a capitalist system, and this is something that I hear a lot. If there was no government to regulate things in a purely capitalist system, monopolies, corporations, evil corporations would just come and set up monopolies and exploit people. And I just don't agree with that. I think that there are certain industries or areas where you can argue about whether there is a natural monopoly or not, and violence is actually I find the most interesting one and the most fundamental one. But for everything else, I agree with you. Like, the natural forces of the market will eventually play out. And Murray Rothbard talks about this a lot. He's got a series of lectures that you can listen to for free, I think, in Apple Podcasts or online, where he talks about the fact that monopolies aren't actually a natural feature of a pure free market system. Whenever you see a monopoly or a cartel, if you dig a little deeper, you're almost always going to find some element of government intervention that is holding that thing together. And you said this yourself, part of the reason these companies get big, and then all of a sudden they're able to engage in regulatory capture, politics, manipulation of that nature to maintain their position. But if they're totally exposed to free market forces, they're going to still have to serve the consumers. He gives examples of railroads, of energy companies, of all sorts of industries through the decades that have tried to form a cartel. And the only way you can do that is by coming together and agreeing to restrict the supply of whatever products you're producing in order to get a higher price for it. And always there's someone who comes in and tries to serve consumers better and breaks that up. So look, I think banking, commercial banking and central banking is the best example of a cartel that has been incredibly successful. It's lasted about 100 years or more in the US. And it's a perfect example of the fact that it's only perpetuated because you have an entity it's not a government entity, the Federal Reserve, but it's certainly an entity that's approved by government that engages in that regulatory capture to sustain a self-serving cartel system.
Yeah, well said. All right, after almost 2 hours of conversation, I wanted to ask you about the movie, or the film rather. So, I think it was a great film. And like we said at the very beginning of this conversation, you've got to frame the issue and problem of money first before people can understand it as a problem and look for solutions, right? As you were saying, rather than just going right in with Bitcoin, people have to know what's going on with money. And I think your film did a really good job with that. One thing that I always find funny about when clips are taken from, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, that era, it's so interesting to watch commercials from a different era, because when you're outside of the time in which they were produced, all the different nuances that go unnoticed when you're in the time are blatantly obvious outside of the time. And they seem so like corny, so over the top, so obvious, so shocking in some cases. And I'm sure the ads that, most people consume today on TV will be seen as exactly the same way in 50 years from now. But it does speak to the kind of intoxication of the current moment that people are in that causes, these things not to be noticed, and therefore only the message that the marketer was attempting to get across, or at least, that's the primary, that's what's noticed the most. And I think that's good for the type of film that you put together, because it really illustrates the absurdity of a lot of the aspects of the money we use in the monetary system that we engage in. Because, as you pluck, things from that era that were, either advertisements or explainers about the system, it all seems much more absurd, and you don't have to do any other work than just to show it. So 2 questions about the film. What inspired you, to put it together? And, what has the reception been? What are your ambitions with filmmaking in the space? That kind of stuff.
Well, I thought that, if you look at the traditional way to make a film like this, you would have to go out and interview people, that you have to go and collect all the footage, be it visual or audio yourself, which first of all just wasn't practical in the current environment. Like, none of us are traveling, we're all stuck at home, or when I was doing this in April or whenever, I certainly was. So it was, I guess, working with what you've got, but it was just, that realization that there was so much material already out there, podcasters doing such good work, that I felt that seemed like a more sensible way to try and do this, to build on what's already been done, and just to try and synthesize out the points that I thought were the most critical and build that into a narrative. And then, I was just coming across some of these old cartoons, old ads. Some of them are Soviet propaganda. Some of them are old American political ads, old cartoons, old footage. And you realize that these issues have been around for a long time. But I think letting some of that stuff speak for itself, rather than forcing a view down. I mean, look, the film does force its view down your throat if you look at it in its entirety. But letting some of this footage just run without much commentary to speak for itself, I think ended up being quite effective. And that was just it turned out to be a really efficient way to make a film, to just get out there and do it without asking for permission, without worrying about copyright. I mean, I'm not trying to steal people's ideas or plagiarize. I feel like it's more a project in extended sort of meme making. Like you just take, and that's where I find Twitter such a great resource, because all these ideas are percolating, little clips are popping up, snippets of audio, things like this. And over the course of months, this stuff is kind of making an impression, and helping build a narrative in your head. And then, I guess the work was in going back and putting it all together. But the fact that the material was there, and I was able to, it was really a process in editing, made it feasible. It was a project that was able to come together quickly. There wasn't too much reflection. It wasn't too much in the way of analysis or second drafts. It was just made it and put it out there, and people seem to like the message.
And when you used audio from like Preston and Breedlove and a bunch of other people in the space, was that just from your own journey? You were kind of taking notes and then you just drew from that, or did you have to actively search for these sort of takes from people when you were putting it all together?
Yeah, I had to go back, because most of this stuff I'd listened to at some point in the last year or so. And then you would remember, I associate almost each person with a certain line of analysis that I find particularly compelling. Like for Robert Breedlove, he talks about the concept of digital scarcity. He talks about how Bitcoin builds on gold. He talks about the path dependence of Bitcoin, how it's a one-time discovery. And so, I associate that with him, and I find that such a compelling analysis. Or Preston comes at it from a different angle. He talks about central banking and a more modern analysis of the problems that we've got right now. And so, or Michael Goldstein, has a different, he comes from, I've heard him talk a lot about more traditional Austrian economic analysis. So I sort of had all these people's ideas, but yeah, it was like a laborious process to go back and listen to podcasts, re-listen to a lot of stuff. I mean, it's entertaining still, but picking out those, those snippets that I think sum things up the best. Obviously, Seyfried probably features most heavily in the film, and the same process with him.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't sure if people were going to respond positively to that. Like the podcasters, I sort of reached out to the people. I reached out to a lot of the podcasters before I made the film public, just saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm just trying, I'm so appreciative that you guys have made this material public. I'm trying to build on top of it and synthesize it. And the response to that was positive, which is really good.
Nice. And just as a technical note, as with when we had the book club, I'm still at the cabin right now, and once the daylight leaves me, all I have is a few cheap lamps around. So it's not the if I go dark, that's why.
You're slowly fading away, but I can hear you
relying
loud and
on
clear.
daylight. Yeah, yeah. So what's kind of your thoughts, or as you say, the feedback I think has been positive thus far. You've got a background in this kind of stuff. I mean, do you have ambitions to do more stuff? Because I think there's a lot of groups that seem to be popping up now, or individuals or groups that are really taking the kind of meme wars to another level, whether that's through videos or just static memes or short clips. Like, it's really amping up. And as we were discussing earlier, I think we were talking about the money printer entering the public lexicon. I mean, that's what the memes are, the most effective way to kind of implant that mind virus in people and really get them thinking about these things, which is, one, why it's so awesome, all the memes that come out of the space, but two, why I think so many people who have the interest and capability to do so are really putting more effort into it because they realize how impactful it could be. So, do you have plans to do a follow-up or do more, or where's your head at with all this stuff?
Definitely. I think I've realized that it's actually an effective method of working in the space. It's this idea of building on audio that's already been done, and sort of drawing together visuals from over the years. It seems to be a method that's working for me. So yeah, I'm still experimenting on that. I after I finished this most recent project, I sort of went down I obviously want to get to Bitcoin itself and really dig into that at some point. But I got a bit sidetracked recently exploring more of a theme around politics and the state, the monopoly on violence, and a sort of anarcho-capitalist view of the world. So that fascinated to me, the point where that's what I'm working on right now, a project that comes at it from that angle, and that draws mainly on the work of Murray Rothbard. So that that's what I'm working on right now. I'm far enough into it that it's got some legs, and that'll be the next project that'll hopefully be able to get out there in the next few months. So yeah, I think I'll just keep at it as long as it seems to be working.
Nice. And I wanted to ask you this a bit earlier, but you seem to have come to the space relatively recently, right? Like a year or so ago. And you've produced this film. Is this your way of kind of expressing your enthusiasm around this stuff? Like, when this clicked for you and you went, fully into it, did you have that period where you were kind of telling everybody, that would, lend you an ear for a moment about this stuff? Or did you just kind of sequester all that expression into the film, and for you, maybe you thought that would be a more effective means or more constructive or whatever? What was your, is that where it came about?
I've tried not to ear bash too many people about it. I mean, I've got a few close friends, and even in my family, I'm lucky enough to have an environment where we can debate these kind of stuff and thrash out ideas.
Nice.
But I was doing a lot of writing as well. Like I do love to write, but I wasn't about Bitcoin, about my views on economics. But I never got to the point where I put anything together that I was really happy with, that I thought really expressed what I wanted to say. And so, yeah, one day I just hit upon the fact of, I think it was really the what the fuck happened in 1971 meme and those guys. That I think what inspired me to come from the angle that I did. I heard them talking about how they thought it would be a great idea for a film, and I was like, yeah, actually they're right, like it would be. And I just started, I just threw a few old clips and photos together, and I was like, oh yeah, there's something here, and just built on that. So yeah, exactly. It was my way to express all these things that have been banging around in my head for a long time that I hadn't really had the chance to discuss in a public forum before.
Right. All right. Last two questions. So the second last one is, what is money? How do you define money?
The most compelling analysis of money that I've heard is money being stored energy. It's basically people, in order for human civilization to progress, we need to grapple with our environment and transform natural resources in their natural state into a form that is usable or allows us to increase our standard of living. And we do that through our labor, and we've developed, I guess, a hack, which is the use of capital. Capital is basically just tools that give us leverage over our labor to increase our standard of living. And so, and that's how civilization progresses. It's people engaging in a process of production and exchange, voluntary exchange. People specialize in the things that they're best at. And that's really how wealth happens. It has to be thought of within that paradigm. And money of its own accord can't create wealth. It's just an expression of that process of production and exchange. So you labor, and then money allows you to store the value of your labor over time, and then exchange that with someone else down the track. So that's for me the fundamental analysis of money. It's a unit of stored human labor.
All right. Last part is a word association. So I'll just say the word, you tell me what pops into your head. Democracy.
Interesting.
The Lightning Network.
World changing.
Government.
Questionable.
Human rights.
Not to be understood properly without understanding property rights.
Violence.
Unfortunate but inevitable.
Trump.
Deserves a second and not as bad as perhaps it seems at first look.
Controversial. Ego.
Ego is a double-edged sword.
FOMO.
FOMO is good. Wouldn't be a Bitcoin rally without FOMO.
Wealth.
Not to be taken for granted.
Privacy.
Privacy is inseparable from liberty.
Hate speech.
Hate speech is still free speech.
Gold.
Gold is money.
Guns.
Guns, coming from a country where guns are banned 100%, and that owning guns is never, sorry, no, I'm giving a long answer. It's not been part of our paradigm at all. Being exposed to this new world has sort of been a bit of a head explosion for me. So it's still question mark.
Revolution.
Revolution is perpetual. We've always got to question the institutions that we're born into.
Socialism.
Proven to be a bad idea.
Family.
The building block of prosperity.
Inequality.
Inequality of outcome is a fundamental aspect of all forms of life.
Hell.
Hell is, I guess, when good intentions don't work out the way you hope.
Liberty.
Without liberty, then nothing else is important. Liberty is fundamental and can't protect from good or bad outcomes.
Energy.
Energy is life. Energy can't be shunned from. It's synonymous with progress.
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is the future.
Well, Richard, I'm about to recess into the darkness here, so I'm going to sign off. But it's been really fun chatting with you, man, and I really enjoyed the film. I think it's great work, and I think, for a lot of people, it will help shed some light on the state of affairs as they are today, and maybe get them thinking about some alternatives. So, before we shut this thing down, is there any final words or places you want to direct people?
Just to my Twitter, which is rjames_BTC, and the film website is hardmoneyfilm.com. So that's how you can watch it. It's free. It's only half an hour. And then through those two forums, and any updates about future work will come. So thank you so much for giving me the chance to chat with you.
Awesome, man. Well, I'm sure we'll talk again in the future. Until then, take care.
Cheers. Thanks, Jim.
See you, brother. Bye.